The frost that morning was thick enough to crack under a boot heel, and 3 men on a hay wagon slowed just to look at it. The tin shed sat alone on the flat, curved like an overturned barrel, catching the weak winter light on its bare metal skin. One of the men laughed, low and short. Another shook his head and said the family inside would be lucky to see Christmas. Nobody in that stretch of the county had ever tried to live inside war-surplus steel, a shed built for storing engine parts and ammunition crates was not a house. Everyone agreed on that, the way people agree on things they have never had to test themselves. Inside, Ellis Cobb was already awake, though the fire had gone quiet hours before. His son pressed a small palm flat against the curved wall near the stovepipe, the way he had every morning that week, waiting to feel whether the metal had turned to ice again during the night. It had not. The wall was not warm the way a stove is warm, but it was not cold either, not the kind of cold that steel is supposed to hold on to once the fire dies. Somewhere between the frost outside and the quiet room inside, something was behaving in a way none of the men on that wagon would have believed if they had been standing in the room instead of laughing from the road. Ellis did not know yet if it would hold through a real storm. He only knew it had held through one more night than anyone expected. If you are watching this from somewhere cold tonight, tell us where in the comments. Stories like this one survive because people still care enough to remember them. And if frontier ingenuity like this means something to you, subscribing helps keep these stories alive. Ellis Cobb came home from the war with a duffel bag, a bad ear, and a discharge paper that promised him nothing except that the government considered its debt paid. What he did have was 40 acres his father had left him, ground too thin for wheat and too far from town to matter much to anyone else. He also had a wife named Ruth, who had waited 3 years for a man the letters never quite described, and a boy named Peter, who had been born while Ellis was still overseas and did not yet know how to say his father's name properly. There was no money for lumber. There had barely been money for the train ticket home. The lumber mill in town wanted cash up front, and the bank wanted collateral Ellis did not have. A proper cabin, the kind his father had built with 2 neighbors and a week of good weather, was simply not going to happen before the season turned. Ruth never said it directly, but Ellis understood the arithmetic of her silence. They had perhaps 10 weeks before the first hard frost settled in for good. And after that, perhaps 6 months of a winter that this part of the country was known for making difficult even for families with proper walls and full woodsheds. He walked the property most evenings that first month, not because he expected the answer to appear in the dirt, but because standing still with the problem felt worse than moving with it. The boy grew a little each week. The wind coming down off the ridge grew a little sharper. Neither of those things waited for Ellis to solve his lumber problem. It was Ruth, oddly, who first mentioned the surplus depot outside the county seat, a flat stretch of fenced land where the army had left behind more equipment than anyone seemed to want. She had heard from her sister that a farmer 2 towns over had bought a dozen ammunition crates for almost nothing and turned them into a chicken coop. If crates could become a chicken coop, Ellis wondered what else might be sitting behind that fence, waiting for someone poor enough and desperate enough to look twice. He rode out the following Tuesday with what little cash they had left, expecting crates, tarps, maybe a stove. What he found instead, stacked in long curved sections behind a padlocked gate, was something the depot clerk called a Quonset hut. Steel ribs, corrugated panels, a shape built to go up fast and shelter men and machines, never meant to shelter a family through a prairie winter. The clerk sold him a partial set for less than the price of framing lumber for a single wall. Ellis did not entirely understand what he was buying. He only understood that it was steel, it was cheap, and it was the only roof he could afford before the season turned against him. Word travels faster in thin country than in crowded country, and by the time Ellis had the wagon loaded with curved steel panels, at least 2 neighbors already knew what he had bought before he got the load home. Neither of them said anything unkind to his face. They did not need to. A raised eyebrow at the crossroads store said enough. Ruth stood at the edge of the flat where Ellis wanted to build, arms crossed against the wind, looking at the pile of gray metal, like it might rearrange itself into something more familiar if she waited long enough. It did not. Peter, not yet old enough to understand shame, thought the curved panels looked like the shell of some enormous animal, and said so, which made Ruth laugh despite herself for the first time in several days. The real trouble started when Silas Warner rode over. Silas had farmed the next section for close to 30 years and had built 2 cabins and a barn with his own hands. He was not a cruel man, and he did not come to mock. He came because he had seen the panels stacked at the depot years before and had turned them down himself, and he wanted Ellis to understand why before it was too late to change course. Steel, Silas told him, does not behave like wood. Wood holds a little warmth inside itself, slows a chill down before it reaches your skin. Steel does the opposite. It reaches out and pulls the warmth from anything that touches it, your hand, the air near the wall, even the heat sitting close to the stove. A steel house, Silas said, would feel like living inside a cold spoon, no matter how large a fire Ellis kept burning. It was not an ignorant warning. Silas had decades of frost-bitten mornings to support it, and near 10 degrees Fahrenheit outside was not an abstraction to a man who had lost 2 fingers to a January he still talked about reluctantly. Ellis listened to all of it and did not argue, because he did not have an answer yet. He only had a roof he could afford and a calendar that was not going to slow down out of sympathy. That night, lying awake beside Ruth, Ellis turned Silas's warning over the way he turned over most problems, slowly and without much confidence. He was not thinking about steel yet. He was thinking about something else entirely, a memory from childhood he had not touched in years, of a Ukrainian family 2 farms over from where he grew up, and the strange low houses they had built, half into a hillside, walls thick with earth, warm in a way that had nothing to do with any stove. He did not yet know if that memory had anything to do with a shed made of army surplus steel. But it was the first idea that felt like more than waiting for spring to arrive on its own schedule. The structure went up faster than any cabin Ellis had ever helped build, which was, in its own way, unsettling, where a proper log cabin demanded weeks of felling, hauling, and notching. The curved steel ribs bolted together in a matter of days, with Silas's son and a neighbor named Otto Reyes, a young man newly arrived from farther south, lending hands neither of them entirely believed in. Otto, unlike Silas, had grown up around adobe and thick-walled structures built to survive heat rather than cold, and he watched the bare steel go up with a different kind of curiosity. He asked Ellis, more than once, what they planned to do about the wall itself, since steel, this thin, left bare, would do exactly what Silas warned it would do. Ellis did not yet have a full answer. What he had was a plan taking rough shape, built from that half-remembered image of earth-banked houses from his childhood. If a wall could hold warmth by trapping air and mass around it, rather than relying on the material itself, then perhaps the steel did not need to be the wall. It could be the bones, and something else could become the actual barrier between his family and the weather. The shape of the Quonset hut helped in one respect nobody had expected. Its curve meant snow and rain would have less reason to pool anywhere along the roofline, sliding instead of settling, the way Ellis had once heard an old roofer describe a good roof as one that taught weather where to go rather than fighting it directly. By the second week, the shells stood complete, a long gray half-cylinder low against the flat ground, doors framed in at one end, a stovepipe fitted through a plate near the peak. From a distance, it looked exactly like what neighbors already called it under their breath, a tin shed, the kind meant for tractors, not children. Ruth walked through it for the first time with Peter on her hip, her boots echoing oddly off the curved metal in a way no wooden cabin ever had. She did not say what she was thinking, but Ellis saw her hand rest flat against the cold steel wall for a long moment, testing something, though the real test was still weeks away. That night, the first true frost of the season arrived early, weeks ahead of what most families expected. It was not the storm that would decide anything. It was only a preview, and even a preview was enough to reveal a serious flaw before Ellis had time to properly prepare for it. By the fourth morning after the first hard frost, something was clearly wrong inside the shelter, and it was not the kind of wrong that patience alone would fix. Ellis woke to the sound of Peter coughing, a small, dry, persistent cough that had not been there a week earlier, and to the sight of water beaded along the inside of the steel wall nearest the boy's cot, some of it already frozen into a thin crust near the base. Ruth found more of it near the door frame, and again where the stovepipe met the roof plate. The bare metal, exactly as Silas had warned, was pulling warmth from the air inside the shelter fast enough that moisture in that warmer air was condensing directly onto the cold steel, then freezing overnight into a fine layer of ice that melted again each time the stove was lit. It was not a dramatic failure. Nothing collapsed. Nothing blew away in a storm. It was a slow, damp, persistent problem, the kind that does not announce itself as a crisis until a child's cough lingers into a second week, and a mother starts watching the wall more closely than she watches the weather outside. Silas came by again, not to gloat, though Ellis half expected it, but because Ruth had mentioned the trouble to his wife at the Crossroads store, and news like that traveled quickly in a place where everyone's winter depended a little on everyone else's. Silas looked at the frost pattern along the base of the wall and nodded slowly, the way a man nods when a prediction he did not want to be right turns out to be right anyway. He did not say, "I told you so." He said something more useful, which was that a wall behaving like this needed to stop being a single wall and start being two things with something dead and still in between them, air that was not moving, the way a good coat works, not by generating warmth itself, but by refusing to let the warmth already made escape too quickly. Ellis already suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed by a man who had spent 30 winters in that county gave him something he had not had before, which was permission to stop treating the steel as the problem and start treating it as only half of the answer. The other half was still sitting in his memory, unfinished, from a childhood he had not thought about since the war took him overseas. That evening, for the first time since buying the surplus panels, Ellis rode out again, not to the depot, but to the low, earth-covered farmhouse 2 counties, over where the family Otto had once mentioned, distant relations of his own neighbors, had lived for over a decade in a structure built the old way, walls thick with soil and straw, warm in weather that put lesser houses to shame. The farmhouse Ellis rode to belonged to a family named Sikora, Ukrainian immigrants who had settled that stretch of land nearly 15 years earlier and built a home that most passing travelers mistook for a low hill until they noticed the door. Mrs. Sikora, a woman in her 60s with hands permanently stained by garden soil, was not surprised by Ellis's visit. She had heard, in the way rural news travels, about the tin house 2 counties over that everyone was talking about. She walked him around the outside of her own home first, showing him the thick bank of earth and dried grass piled against the lower half of the walls, packed and shaped over years rather than built in a single season. The earth was not there for beauty, she explained, and it was not there to make the wall warm on its own. It was there to slow down how quickly warmth already inside the house was allowed to leave. Inside, she pressed his palm against the interior wall near the stove, then against a wall on the far side of the room, away from any fire. The difference was smaller than Ellis expected, and that, she told him, was exactly the point. A house built this way did not need one wall blazing hot and another wall freezing. It needed every wall behaving evenly, patient rather than dramatic, the way she had learned to be patient after 15 winters in ground that had not always felt forgiving. She used a word Ellis had heard once or twice from an old teacher back home, ThermalMass, though she did not use the technical language of a schoolroom to describe it. She said it more simply, the stone and earth were not making heat. They were storing it, the way a person might save a little money each week rather than spending everything the moment it arrived, so that there was something left over when the lean days came. What made Ellis's problem different and harder was that his walls were steel first, not earth first. Mrs. Sikora considered this for a long moment, then suggested something Ellis had not fully considered, which was to treat the steel shell the way a person treats a coat, rather than a wall, an inner layer, an outer layer, and something still and dead trapped between them, whether that was packed straw, dried grass, or a mixture of clay and earth applied directly against the corrugated panels themselves. She warned him plainly that this would not be fast, and it would not be clean. Earth-based building rewarded patience and punished shortcuts. If he packed the material poorly, left gaps, or rushed the drying, the whole effort might do little more than add weight to a wall that was still underneath everything, letting the cold walk straight through it. Ellis rode home with more work ahead of him than he had expected and less certainty than he had hoped to find. But for the first time since the frost had started weeping down his walls, he had something resembling a plan, one built not from steel or lumber, but from a kind of knowledge that had crossed an ocean and 2 generations before it ever reached him. The work of insulating the shelter took longer than raising it had, and it was far less satisfying to watch progress on. Ellis, with help from Otto, and eventually a skeptical but curious Silas, spent the better part of 3 weeks packing a mixture of dried grass, straw, and clay against both the outer base of the curved steel walls and, more carefully, along sections of the interior where condensation had been worst. The process was not glamorous. It involved mixing clay with water until it held together without cracking, layering it with straw, the way Mrs. Sikora had described, and packing it firmly enough to eliminate air pockets large enough to let moisture travel, while still leaving smaller trapped pockets of still air that would act as the actual barrier against the cold. Too wet, and the mixture would not hold its shape through a freeze. Too dry, and it crumbled before it ever bonded to the steel beneath it. Peter, recovering slowly from the cough that had frightened Ruth more than she admitted aloud, spent afternoons watching from just inside the doorway, occasionally handing his father handfuls of dried grass gathered from the flat behind the shelter. It became, without anyone deciding it should, a small family project, rather than only Ellis's private struggle, and Ruth found herself more than once mixing clay with her own hands, rather than only watching from a distance. Silas, true to his nature, did not stop offering opinions, though they shifted in tone as the weeks passed. His early warnings about steel had been about bare metal, exposed directly to cold air. What Ellis was building now was something closer to what Silas himself understood from a lifetime of proper cabins, a wall with mass and stillness built into it, only assembled backward from how Silas would have started. Steel first, insulation second, rather than logs from the beginning. By the time the packed clay along the base had dried enough to hold its shape reliably, an early test presented itself without anyone asking for it. A modest snowstorm rolled through, nothing like the deep winter still to come, but enough cold and wind to offer a real comparison against the condensation problem of only a month earlier. The wall near Peter's cot this time stayed dry. Not warm in any dramatic sense, but dry, and free of the fine ice crust that had worried Ruth so badly weeks before. It was not proof that the shelter would survive a true blizzard. It was proof that the idea itself was not foolish, which, after weeks of packing clay in the cold with aching hands, felt like enough to keep going. The modest storm had been encouraging, but it had also revealed a second problem, quieter than the condensation, but potentially more dangerous once real winter weather arrived. The insulated walls were holding warmth reasonably well, but a persistent draft still crept in near the doorframe, where the curved steel met the wooden door Ellis had built to seal the entrance. It was the kind of flaw easy to underestimate, since a small draft near a doorway rarely feels like the difference between comfort and danger, right up until a real blizzard turns a small gap into a channel funneling wind directly at whoever happens to be sitting nearest the door. Silas, who had by now shifted from skeptic to something closer to an invested neighbor, pointed out that a house could have excellent walls everywhere except one weak seam, and still fail exactly where that seam existed. Ellis spent several evenings studying the door frame itself, running a hand slowly along its edges, the way Mrs. Sikora had taught him to feel for temperature differences, rather than only look for visible gaps. He found the problem eventually, not a single obvious hole, but several small irregularities where the curved steel did not meet the straight wooden frame cleanly, leaving narrow paths for moving air, even where the gap looked, to the eye, nearly closed. The fix was not glamorous. More clay and packed straw worked carefully into the irregular seams, along with a heavier canvas hung just inside the door itself, creating a second barrier of still air between the door and the room proper. It was not a permanent solution in the way the wall insulation had become. It required checking and repacking periodically as materials shifted and settled, a maintenance task rather than a single, triumphant fix. Ruth, watching Ellis work at the door seam for the third evening in a row, asked him plainly whether all of this effort was actually going to matter once a real storm arrived, or whether they were simply delaying an inevitable failure with increasingly elaborate patches. It was a fair question, and Ellis did not have a fully confident answer. He only had the evidence in front of him, a shelter that had failed once, been corrected once, and held through one small test since. Whether it would hold through something larger remained. As autumn deepened toward the season, everyone in the county quietly dreaded. An open question neither Ellis nor anyone watching his progress could yet answer with certainty. The blizzard arrived in early winter, later than some years, but with a reputation, once it settled in, for being among the harder storms the county had seen in nearly a decade. Local accounts from that period described 2 full days of sustained wind and heavy snow, with temperatures dropping well below what the family had experienced during any of their earlier tests. Word of the approaching storm reached the flat a full day before it arrived, giving Ellis just enough time to check every seam he could reach, repack a section of clay near the door that had begun to crack slightly in the cold, and bring in enough firewood to last considerably longer than he expected to need it, a habit Silas had drilled into him over the preceding weeks. Ruth kept Peter close during the final hours before the storm proper arrived, and the family settled in with the stove burning steadily, the curved steel roof holding a strange sound overhead as wind built against it, different from the sound wind made against a flat wooden roof, a lower, rounder hum rather than a sharp rattle. For the first several hours, the shelter performed better than any of them had quite dared to hope. The walls stayed dry. The air inside remained noticeably warmer than the brutal cold outside, though nobody in that room was measuring precisely how much warmer. Only that conversation remained possible without shivering, and that Peter slept through the first several hours without the cough that had worried them weeks earlier. The trouble came well after midnight, when the wind shifted direction, something local farmers later recalled as unusual for a storm of that particular pattern, coming instead from an angle that struck the shelter's door side directly rather than glancing along its curved roof, as it had for most of the evening. Ruth noticed it first, a change in the draft near the door, subtle at first, then unmistakable, as the temperature near that side of the room began dropping in a way the rest of the shelter was not. Ellis woke fully within moments of Ruth's hand on his shoulder. The room dim, except for the low glow of the stove. Wind now audible in a way it had not been earlier, pressing hard against the door side of the shelter with a force that made the wooden frame itself shift slightly against the steel it was set into. Peter had begun coughing again, not severely, but enough that Ruth's face in the low light carried a fear Ellis recognized immediately, the particular fear of a parent watching a child's breathing change during a night when help was not a short walk away, but an impossible one, given the storm outside. There was no time to properly diagnose the failure the way Ellis had during the earlier calmer test. He had, in that moment, essentially 3 choices, each with real risk attached. He could attempt to repack the door seam from inside, working with cold clay that might not hold properly in the current temperature and humidity, risking time and warmth for an uncertain fix. He could move the family's bedding away from the door entirely, toward the warmer section of wall near the stove, accepting the draft rather than fighting it directly. Or he could attempt to seal the gap more crudely, using spare canvas and rope to create an emergency barrier, a solution Silas had mentioned once in passing as a temporary measure rather than a proper fix. Ellis chose the third option, reasoning that clay applied in cold, damp conditions was unlikely to bond properly before morning, and that moving the family alone would not address wind now strong enough to be felt even several feet from the door itself. Working quickly by lantern light, with Ruth holding the canvas steady against the wind pushing from the other side, Ellis lashed a heavy section of spare canvas across the entire doorframe, sealing it crudely but completely, against the specific gap the wind had found. It was not an elegant solution. It was not the kind of careful, patient work Mrs. Sikora had described weeks earlier. It was the kind of decision a person makes at 3 a.m. with a coughing child and a storm outside that does not pause to let anyone finish thinking properly. Once the canvas held, Ellis and Ruth sat close to the stove with Peter between them, uncertain whether the fix would last through the remaining hours of darkness, or whether they would need to make a harder decision before daylight arrived. The wind eased sometime before dawn, gradually rather than suddenly, the way storms in that region often wound down according to accounts from families who lived through that same winter. By the time gray light reached the flat, the worst of it had clearly passed, though snow remained piled deep enough against the shelter's curved side to reach nearly to the roofline in places. Inside, the canvas over the door had held, sagging in places but unbroken, and the draft that had woken Ruth in the night had faded along with the wind itself. Peter slept, finally, in a deeper and quieter way than he had managed since the coughing first began weeks earlier, and Ruth, checking his forehead in the pale morning light, allowed herself the first full breath she had taken since midnight. Silas arrived on foot not long after sunrise, having walked the distance between properties specifically to check on the family rather than out of any remaining doubt about whether the shelter would survive. He found Ellis outside, examining the canvas seal and already planning a more permanent repair for the section that had failed. And for a long moment, neither man said anything about the doubts either of them had carried into the storm. What Silas said instead, eventually, was that he had lived in that county for 30 years and never expected to see a tin shed outlast a storm that had, according to later recollections, damaged proper wooden cabins on at least 2 neighboring farms. He did not apologize for his earlier warnings, because they had not been wrong exactly, only incomplete, missing the piece Ellis had needed to travel 2 counties over to find. Word of the shelter's survival spread through the crossroads, store faster than word of its construction ever had. Over the following winters, according to local accounts, at least 2 other families in the county experimented with similar earth-packed steel structures of their own, adapting surplus materials that had, until Ellis proved otherwise, seemed suited only for storing tractors rather than sheltering children. The tin shed itself stood on that flat for many years afterward, patched and repacked repeatedly as seasons demanded, never beautiful, never quite silencing every doubt it had once inspired. But Peter grew up inside those curved steel walls, and it was said in later years that when his own children asked him about the cold, he would press their palms flat against an old familiar wall and tell them to wait and feel and decide for themselves what the metal was actually doing. The valley remembered the blizzard that winter for its severity. The Cobb family remembered it for the wall that held. This story is presented for educational and historical storytelling purposes. It is not engineering, construction, or safety advice.